That was Martha Wainwright singing These Flowers. And you might recognize Martha because she's the sister of Rufus Wainwright, and she often sings with him both on his albums and on stage. And she actually was also recently here in Cornwall when she sang at the Eden Project with Paolo Nutini, so maybe some of you guys got a chance to hear that concert. Alright, so back to dangerous plants. I already went through a list of kind of the worst offenders in the plant world, and now I'm going to talk a little less generally about plants that are bad and talk more specifically about the ones that are around us and that we might be exposed to more often than others. And as I already mentioned, poinsettias are often the species that gets a whole lot of flack, but actually they're not nearly as bad as people tend to think, because their sap is only mildly toxic, and if your pets are just kind of nibbling on the leaves a little bit during the holidays, it's probably not going to end up hurting them, or at least not hurting them very much. Although, of course, if you don't want to take any chances, it's certainly worth it to put them up high where the cats and the dogs aren't going to be able to reach them. But actually, there are much worse plants that are commonly found in and around your home. So in your house, well, actually, I guess this one kind of qualifies for both, but both in and on the edge of your home, you probably have a little bit of English ivy somewhere. It is pretty rampant in these parts, and it's quite easy to come across. And the berries of this, I've actually probably never seen it that I can remember, but it does come into fruit once a year at least, and so you have these berries that are produced, and they're actually very bitter and very unpleasant to eat, and so people normally don't ever try these too often. But if for some reason you do actually manage to ingest them because you have a mistaken ID or because they fall into something, they actually can cause some pretty severe gastrointestinal problems, and also delirium, respiratory problems, and if you come into contact with the sap, it can be quite problematic for the skin. So if you have a little pot of this on a table somewhere in your house, it's definitely the kind of thing that would be good to get away from kids in case they want to reach out and try a few of the berries whenever it goes into fruit. Another example of something that's frequently used for decoration in homes is a ficus, or a rubber tree. So rubber trees are one type of ficus. There are lots of other types, and ficus is a fig. And both of these guys are in the mulberry family. And the latex, again, of these plants can provoke some pretty severe allergic reactions. Now that's not true for everyone. Because it is an allergy, there are going to be some people that react much more than others. But if you are one of those people that's allergic, then your skin will itch and puff up, and at least one person has been documented going into anaphylactic shock. And actually that's just from the presence of the fig tree in the home. And as soon as the fig tree was removed, the person was totally fine again. So it can be a pretty severe reaction that some people have to this. Another example is the pencil tree, which I've already mentioned, also called the pencil cactus or the milk bush because of the sap that it produces. Now, all of those are euphorbs, which is what the poinsettia is, as I already mentioned. And I also kind of alluded to the fact that these are becoming more and more popular these days. And that's because they form this really kind of nice row if you plant them. So you can get them to make a fence, or you can kind of make, as I said, in our greenhouse we had a nice arch of them over the doorway. So they can be easily worked into certain figures if you want to have a certain shape in your house. And these do cause eye irritation, and the corrosive sap can cause skin rashes. So that's another one that is increasingly common in homes that should really be looked out for. Now, outside in your garden, there are also lots of things, and this is actually where things tend to get a bit more scary because they are a bit more extreme. So azaleas and rhododendrons, again, that's a little bit repetitive because azaleas are a type of rhododendron, but these can contain something called granotoxin, and that's found pretty much in everything, in their leaves, in their flowers, in their nectar, in their pollen. And because it's in the nectar and the pollen, if you have bees that are rubbing themselves around in these things and then they make honey, obviously the honey is not going to be edible either because it will also cause a severe reaction. And actually, we have lots of records of these plants causing issues, but even these go all the way back to Pliny the Elder. And he wrote saying that azaleas and rhododendrons were nature's creation that would render mankind a little more cautious and somewhat less greedy. And the reason that these plants are so bad is that they can cause heart problems, vomiting, dizziness, and weakness. So obviously if you have quite a lot of these, if it's causing a heart problem, you can in fact eventually cause death. Now another one that you're probably more familiar with as being a toxic plant is the foxglove. And until I started doing research on foxgloves, I didn't realize that they have a number of delightful other names. And these include fairy bells, rabbit flowers, throatwort, and witches' thimbles. And like azaleas and rhododendrons, all parts of these plants are problematic. And again, all these things kind of cause similar types of problems. They irritate the skin and the digestive system. They can lead to convulsions and headaches and, again, heart problems. And actually, the whole reason that foxgloves are not necessarily complete evil is that they produce something called digoxin, or digoxin, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that's a cardiac glycoside that can be used to treat heart conditions such as fibrillation and flutter and heart failure. And in fact, back in the day, before we had kind of chemically produced things, people used to use foxglove in order to regulate heart issues and help medicate people during surgery. And in fact, a lot of the things that doctors prescribe today are manufactured based on the chemical properties of these chemicals from the plants. And so basically they just looked at the organic structure and they've just recreated that in a lab in a modified way. Another plant that is quite naughty is the hydrangea, and you can probably tell from the coloring that hydrangea contains low levels of cyanide, so cyanide's linked with the color blue. And the flowers of hydrangeas are often used as cake toppers, and they can be put on dinner tables often in restaurants whenever you want to have a decoration. And so a lot of people might think that these are edible, or at least they're not toxic, but in fact they are quite bad for you. And interestingly, these are one of the few things that have an antidote available to them. So a lot of these plants you just kind of have to weather the bad effects and maybe take a few drugs to kind of offset the discomfort or to put your heart rhythm back in line. But with hydrangeas there is actually an antidote that's been created. And while I'm on the topic of cyanide, I will also briefly mention that apple seeds are something else that contains cyanide. And I remember reading a few years ago when I was younger that there was someone who once was looking, for kind of the next big thing in the culinary world, and so he decided that he was going to start experimenting with different seeds and different ways of preparing seeds in order to make them tastier and kind of get people to eat seeds more often. And so he did this whole big experiment on apple seeds, and he just took hundreds of apples and he collected all of their seeds and tried a number of different techniques for preparing them, and then ate all of these to try them out and see, kind of compare them. And he ended up killing himself because he ate all the cyanide basically, and he died of cyanide poisoning. So the next time you're eating an apple and you contemplate eating the whole thing from stem to base, then maybe you should at least consider plucking out the seeds first. And other plants, I'm not going to go into a list of all the plants that are in your yard that aren't so great, but other ones that you might just want to kind of know about are things like wisteria, anthurium, oleander, and also daffodils. And the last one of those kind of caught my eye because, of course, daffodils are really common around here. And I thought, well, who in the world is, getting exposed to daffodils? Well, it turns out that some people have confused their bulbs as onions. And so this has also happened with tulips. And so people see the bulb and they think it's edible and they prepare it in the same way that they would an onion. And it turns out that both daffodils and tulips have toxic bulbs. So that's quite a bad idea. Don't try that one. I think basically the idea is if it has a large yellow flower that's often associated with whales, it's probably best to stay away from it and not eat it. So here I am maligning all of these plants, but I should also mention that some of them have some other uses that are quite interesting, and that's actually partially why we end up coming into contact with these. And the first of these, most obviously, is bouquets. So like I mentioned, with the hydrangeas being put on cakes as cake toppers and on tables for dinner, bouquets are often, a way that we come into contact with these plants because they're very pretty, and so people keep them around in order to decorate, and they don't realize that these plants are posing a threat. So some of the examples of bouquet flowers that often cause problems are larkspurs, lily of the valley, bleeding heart, sweet pea, tulip. I already mentioned the bulbs were bad, but also the rest of it is also toxic. hyacinth, chrysanthemum, and also aconite, which is also known as monkshood. So with chrysanthemum, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but chrysanthemum is kind of interesting because the blossoms have been used medicinally, which is there's a case that you see with a lot of these things, that in small doses actually these can have some use, but in large doses they can be quite bad for you. It turns out that chrysanthemums are actually highly toxic to some people because the people have allergies to them. And you can see why these would be toxic, because actually some species of chrysanthemum can be used to produce something called pyrethrum, which is used as a pesticide. So chances are, if a plant contains something that can be used to kill lots of other organisms, it's probably not very good for you either. Another interesting one in this list is monkshood. And I didn't know this, but florists actually can't handle monkshood with their bare hands. Well, they could very briefly, but if they do it all day when they're arranging bouquets, then they can have serious problems. And it starts out with just being numbness in the fingers and hands where they're holding onto the plant. But eventually, if they've got enough exposure, it can cause cardiac problems and even death. So that's obviously quite a bad one. Another use of a poisonous plant is poison arrows that can be used for fighting and hunting. And you hear a lot about this, particularly in South America and to some extent in South Africa. So one of the really famous ones from South America is curare, and this immobilizes prey, which lets hunters then easily capture them. So if they dip their arrows in curare and then they shoot up into a tree, then often they'll shoot at birds or monkeys, and basically the animal will just perch there, and they have to go up and collect it, or it will, depending on when they hit it and what the animal's doing, it might just make them drop out of the tree so they can then collect it underneath on the ground. And that's obviously quite a convenient way to go hunting because there's a lot less struggle involved. And actually doctors in the area used to use this in order to keep patients still, but the problem was that it didn't relieve the pain at all. It basically just completely immobilized the patient so they couldn't struggle, and this obviously made the doctor's job a lot easier because they weren't having to hold anyone down, but the patients were still in immense pain because they could feel everything that was happening. And when they were doing this, basically the entire system shuts down. And so normally you would have someone dying because eventually they asphyxiate, basically, because their lungs no longer move and keep oxygen flowing. And so what they would do, and this is actually quite advanced if you think about when this was being done, it's kind of an antiquated technique, but they knew enough to use artificial respiration to keep the patients alive. So they would kind of use a little bellows or a pump with their hand on the lungs, and they would keep the oxygen flowing through the body during the procedure so that the patients would then survive. Another example of poison is strychnine, and this one's often used in combination with curare. And you probably recognize the name strychnine because it was commonly used as a rodent poison kind of back in the day, but anymore it's been banned in most places because it is highly toxic, and also because people would kind of co-opt it and use it to kill other people, and so they've kind of tried to phase that out a little bit. This kind of technique has also been used not just in South America but also in South Africa, well, Africa in general, and in Asia. So for instance, in Africa you've got the poison arrow plant, which is a pretty obvious name, and in Asia you've got the upas tree, which fulfills a similar function. Another kind of interesting thing that is an African custom that is not something that's been really well documented or really widespread, but there is a West African custom, or I should say was, called trial by ordeal. And this was something where, actually this is quite similar in many ways to kind of the methods that were used during witch hunts in history here in the West. But basically they would, if someone was accused of something, they would have to swallow a bean, and the reaction to swallowing the bean would indicate whether the person was innocent or guilty. So if you vomited, then you were innocent, and if you died or you purged the bean through your bowels, then you were guilty. And different plants were used by there were different judges, and they would often select among the different plants depending on whether they thought the person was actually guilty or not. So they would kind of help out people a little bit. So for instance, the things that they might use would be the calabar bean, the tangan poison nut, the sassy bark, or the strychnine tree. And all of these things produce beans which are highly toxic. And one of the interesting things is that people themselves could also influence this process, only they didn't realize it at the time. But basically, if you swallowed it whole, then the toxins weren't going to be released in your body as much, and so you probably would survive, even though you'd be quite uncomfortable. But if you chewed it in little bites, so maybe you were trying to delay the process of ingesting it because you were feeling guilty and you didn't want the condemnation, well, if you chew it, then actually you are releasing more of the toxins in your body, and you are going to be more likely to die. And so this is something that is obviously a horrible use of these plants, but another way in which these naughty, wicked plants could be used by humans. And I will briefly have another song break. This time it's going to be Whither I'm a Flower by Whiskeytown. And that was Whiskeytown singing Whither I'm a Flower. And as the name suggests, we are drawing to the end of the show. And right before the break, I was discussing some of the uses of these toxic flowers, or toxic plants. And the one last thing that I'll just quickly say is that, as I've already alluded to throughout the show, a lot of these things are actually useful for food. And it all depends on the method of preparation and the part of the plant that's being eaten. So things like pea and corn, rhubarb and elderberry, parts of these plants are actually quite bad for us. But if we soak them long enough in water, or snip off the bad bits and only eat the good bits, or collect them at the right time, then actually all of these can be quite nice. So we know, for instance, the elderberry wine is a very popular thing this time of year. And so it all depends on how you prepare it and how you deal with the plant. And I just want to end on one last note, that actually here I've been focusing on ways that these plants are toxic to us, but actually plants can be kind of wicked in a number of other different ways. So for instance, they can outcompete native species. That's something we see a lot in the US with a plant called kudzu. They can clog boat propellers and waterways, so there are some species of algae that are quite bad about this. They can strangle and steal nutrients from hosts, so things like strangler ferns and dodder. They can cause allergies, and that's something that I certainly have been experiencing over the last couple of months. So things like ragweed and mulberry and Bermuda grass are all quite bad about that. They can poison our pets. They can cause addiction, so drugs like heroin and cigarettes and opium and cocaine, all these things come from plants. Some of them, interestingly, they can promote fire, so things like eucalyptus are actually very volatile, so by being present in the environment they can actually make it more likely that certain habitats will go up in flames. They can do kind of funny things like pollute the air with a foul smell, so things like the corpse flower and the rafflesia and the skunk cabbage can all be very smelly plants. And of course, a lot of them can have very painful parts, things like thorns and burrs. So if you're just kind of walking along innocently, they kind of attack you and hook into you, and you might find several hours later that you've been hauling along a big load of things that have all been stuck into your skin and your clothes. So there are places here in the UK and also elsewhere where you can go see these things all in one place. So for instance, the Alnwick Poison Gardens in Northumberland, or the Chelsea Physic Garden. And I'm going to post online on the website sourcefm.co.uk, and then you can go to the Wildside website specifically, and I'll post some information about where you can go to see some of these plants, and I'll also post some links to some websites related to some of the stuff I've been talking about. And also I will give you some information about the book Wicked Plants and some of the other books that I was reading when I was preparing for this week's broadcast. And that is it for now. I'm going to sign off and play you one last song, and that's going to be Sheryl Crow singing Wildflower. So I hope you enjoyed this show, and I will talk to you next week.